The night on the Ice Age steppe is a predator in itself. Wind shrieks across frozen plains, scouring the earth with shards of snow. At -40, every breath burns like fire in your chest. Every exhale crystallizes in the air before you. Exposed skin goes numb in moments. Modern bodies, wrapped in down and synthetic fleece, struggle to last a single night here. Yet for tens of thousands of years, Paleolithic families not only endured these nights, they thrived, raised children, dreamed and created. How? Not just how they lived by day, hunting and gathering under a brutal sky, but how they slept, night after night, without freezing into silence. What shield did they conjure between flesh and frost? What secret transformed impossible cold into bearable warmth? The answer is stranger, more ingenious, than the image of huddled figures at a cave mouth. It begins with a hidden rule of survival, one that turns the cold itself into a tool. The picture most people carry of Ice Age survival is simple, almost comforting. Families crouched in the back of caves, wrapped in furs, huddled together until morning. But this picture is incomplete, almost a caricature. Caves were not always the solution. Many were drafty, wet, and dangerous, riddled with predators who also sought shelter. A cave was not a home. It was a gamble, and our ancestors did not rely on chance alone. They engineered survival. This is where the myth dissolves and the method emerges. The governing principle of their existence was not mere endurance, but transformation. When nature tries to kill you, you make nature work for you. It was a rule born of necessity, sharpened across generations and carried across continents. The cold was never simply an enemy. It was a force to be bent, trapped, redirected. And in that reordering of the environment lay the secret to sleep itself. Think of it as a triad of survival: earth, bone, and breath. Each one was a material and a concept, woven together into a system of protection. The earth provided anchoring heat and insulation, shaping the ground itself into shelter. Bone provided structure and strength, turning the remains of hunted giants into architectural frames. And breath, the movement of air, harnessed through fire and ventilation, ensured that warmth could be sustained without suffocation. Together, these were not improvisations scratched together in panic. They were deliberate systems, repeatable and refined, a kind of thermal engineering long before the word existed. Start with earth. Soil is never as cold as the air above it. Just a few feet down, below the frost line, temperatures stabilize, resisting the brutal swings of the surface. Early humans learned this intuitively. They dug into the ground, carved hollows that became thermal bowls, shelters half buried where the planet itself provided a steady anchor of warmth. This was not a mere hole in the dirt. It was architecture, aligned with prevailing winds, dug to calculated depths, positioned for drainage, and ringed with materials to control temperature and moisture. Then came bone. On the mammoth steppe, wood was scarce. Stunted by the cold, trees were few and precious, but bones were abundant and enormous. Mammoth skulls, tusks, and long bones became beams and posts, fitted together in circular and oval designs. What might seem grotesque to modern eyes was, in truth, brilliance. These frameworks carried weight, resisted wind, and shaped domes that were both sturdy and spacious. Smaller bones filled the gaps, lattices that supported hides stretched tight like canvas over a tent. But a frame and a pit alone do not keep you alive at -40. This is where breath enters the equation. Fire was obvious, but fire without ventilation kills. Smoke suffocates. Carbon monoxide creeps invisible into lungs. Paleolithic engineers solved this with airflow systems. Low inlets dug near the floor to pull in oxygen, high outlets built into the dome to vent smoke. Convection did the work, warm air rising, cool air drawn in, a steady cycle maintained. In storms, hides acted as flaps, adjustable valves for the atmosphere of the shelter. These were not random strokes of luck. They were blueprints repeated across thousands of years, evidence etched in archaeological sites from Ukraine to Siberia. Taken together, these triad systems, earth for thermal mass, bone for structure, breath for balance, transformed the raw environment into living shelter. Step inside one of these reconstructed dwellings, and you can almost feel it. The wind is muted to a whisper. The glow of fire pulls across hides stitched with sinew. The ground beneath is dry, layered with grass mats. The air is warm enough to sleep, to dream, to plan for the hunt at dawn. This is the hidden rule of survival that rewrites the myth. The Ice Age was not endured by chance, nor by passive hiding in caves. It was conquered by design. Humans became not just hunters of beasts, but architects of climates. They created artificial environments inside natural ones, a feat that echoes forward into every insulated wall, every vent, every thermostat we use today. And this realization opens a door to something larger. If their survival depended on turning nature into a partner rather than an adversary, then their methods must have been precise. Excavations reveal patterns too consistent to be accidents. Burn layers that mark controlled hearths. Post holes that trace repeated layouts. Pits lined with stone or reinforced with bone. Archaeologists see not improvisation but intention. Systems repeated because they worked. Knowledge passed not as rumour but as instruction. Life-saving lessons taught with the gravity of ritual. A mistake in insulation or ventilation was not an inconvenience. It was death. And so, mastery became the inheritance of every new generation. When you picture that, the stereotype of cave dwelling fades into something more striking. Imagine walking across the steppe at dusk, snow sweeping low against the ground. Ahead, in a hollow shielded from the wind, a low dome rises, stitched in hides, ringed with mammoth bones jutting like the ribs of some ancient leviathan. A plume of smoke curls upward, not in chaos, but in a thin, steady column, vented by design. Step inside, and the cold vanishes, replaced by warmth, the scent of wood smoke, the quiet rhythm of human breath. This is not just shelter, it is technology. The method was not uniform everywhere. Geography demanded variation. Where mammoth bone was scarce, wood or stone filled the role. Where soil was too shallow for depressions, snow itself became insulation, packed and layered into walls. But the governing principle never changed. Use the environment's hostility as its own solution. The earth that threatened to freeze you became your insulation. The bone of beasts you hunted became the skeleton of your home. The fire that could suffocate you became safe through airflow designed like an engine. Survival was not resistance, it was collaboration. And in that collaboration lay something greater. Freedom. These engineered shelters allowed families to occupy vast new territories, pushing farther north, exploring landscapes where no unprotected body could last a night. The structures were not static caves, but mobile knowledge, adaptable templates carried in memory and muscle. They were the blueprints that opened continents. This is the untold truth of Ice Age survival. Not caves, not luck, but engineering. And the first key to that engineering lies in the ground itself. Earth, the silent ally, turned frozen nights into survivable ones. But what about the towering architecture of bone, where the remains of giants became houses against the wind? That is the next blueprint, one that reveals how death itself became a framework for life. The first true blueprint of Ice Age shelter began not with mammoth bones or stitched hides, but with the earth itself. The ground was more than a surface to walk upon. It was a resource, a vast reservoir of stable temperature, waiting to be tapped. Our ancestors discovered, through observation and trial, that soil insulated against the chaos of the weather above. Digging down meant safety. A shallow depression was not a mere pit, it was a thermal machine. Picture a family on the steppe at the onset of winter. The air is sharp enough to crack lips and sting eyes. The wind lashes endlessly across open plains. Above ground, the cold roams like a predator, merciless and shifting. But below ground, even a few feet deep, there is calm. Temperatures steady themselves just beneath the frost line, resisting the violent swings that make nights unbearable. By carving depressions into the earth, Ice Age builders created bowls of stability, spaces where heat could be retained, and bodies could rest. These were not haphazard scrapes in the soil. Archaeological sites show careful depth choices. Too shallow, and the cold seeped in. Too deep, and moisture pooled, threatening to rot furs and bedding. Marks of stone tools etched into ancient soil reveal intention, precision. Some hollows were reinforced with stone linings, others bermed with the excavated earth itself to form windbreaks. Each depression was a calculation. How much ground to move, how far down to carve, how to position against prevailing winds. Once the earth gave its bowl, the layering began. Think of it as a series of envelopes, each one trapping air, each one redirecting moisture. At the core were hides, laid fur inward, their fibers capturing warmth in millions of tiny air pockets. Over these went grasses and moss, chosen not only for insulation but for their ability to wick away condensation. A wet shelter was a deadly shelter. Moisture could rob heat faster than any draft. The grasses, dried in autumn sun, became natural sponges, absorbing vapor before it could soak bedding. Over this came the outer shell, reeds, bark, even turf. These formed barriers against wind while still allowing vapor to escape, preventing the suffocating dampness of a sealed tomb. Imagine the crackle of dried reeds as they were pressed into place, the musky scent of bark peeled from stunted trees, the earthy perfume of moss carried into the hollow. The layers worked like the pelts of an animal, each stratum performing its role, together forming a living insulation system. Inside, the effect was profound. The howling wind above became a muted hum, like distant surf. The earth's walls dulled the violence of the outside world. A hearth at the centre amplified the effect, its warmth trapped and reflected inward. Where the step could kill in minutes, the bowl of earth made hours survivable, even comfortable. A child could sleep, an elder could rest, a hunter could recover strength for the next day's pursuit. These semi-subterranean structures were more than clever tricks. They were deliberate technologies. Each decision, from the angle of a slope to the layering of moss, was a choice honed over generations. Archaeologists studying sites in Siberia and Eastern Europe note the recurring patterns: depressions of consistent depth, signs of drainage channels, remnants of layered materials. These were not isolated accidents, but a shared knowledge, repeated across time and space. The earth had been transformed into architecture. The genius of these designs was not just warmth but balance. Too much insulation without ventilation bred dampness and suffocation. Too little left bodies exposed to the cold. The layering acted as a regulator, releasing just enough vapor, holding just enough heat. It was a system tuned by experience, passed from one season to the next, from one band to another. The builders did not simply react to the cold, they anticipated it, engineered for it, treated winter as a known adversary rather than a random catastrophe. Step inside such a shelter in your mind. The entrance is low and narrow, dug deliberately to keep drafts from sweeping in. Your boots crunch on dried grass layered as flooring. The air is warm, faintly smoky, scented with resin and damp moss. Outside, the world rages. Inside, there is quiet, broken only by the murmur of voices, the crack of fire, the sigh of sleepers beneath hides. This is not survival in the sense of bare clinging. It is survival elevated into design. The earth, in these moments, was not an enemy. It was an ally. The same ground that froze mammoths into monuments became a blanket when cut and shaped correctly. The soil that swallowed cold turned into a reservoir of warmth. By mastering this principle, humans bought time, bought safety, bought the ability to think beyond the next night. And in that breathing space, they built culture, memory, and story. But Earth alone was not enough. Depression shelters offered insulation, but they needed frameworks to expand, to rise, to host larger groups. The soil bowl became a foundation, and upon it rose the architecture of giants. Mammoth bones, massive, durable, plentiful, became beams, arches, and supports. Hides stretched taut over them transformed hollows into domes, structures capable of withstanding blizzards. The ground gave the anchor, bone gave the skeleton. Together, they created homes that could last seasons, even years. And so, the path leads forward. From the muffled warmth of earth bowls to the looming silhouettes of bone structures on the horizon. Where the soil whispered stability, the bones shouted permanence. Where one was subtle, the other was monumental. To step into a mammoth bone dwelling was to enter a collaboration between human ingenuity and the remains of titans. It was to see survival not just in terms of endurance, but of architecture. The next chapter belongs to these structures, to the sound of tusks dragged across frost, to the crack of sinew threads stitching hides, to the glow of fire licking across skull-domed ceilings. Earth may have cradled humanity through the cold, but bone gave it walls, and breath gave those walls life. From the frozen soil rose walls of bone. Where earth had cradled human warmth, mammoth remains lifted it upward, transforming hollows into full dwellings. Across the steppe, archaeologists uncover these ghostly footprints. Rings of tusks, skulls aligned like sentinels, long bones stacked in interlocking patterns. To us, they look like ruins of a forgotten cathedral. To Ice Age families, they were life itself, engineered from the bodies of giants. The process began with the ground itself. Builders carved depressions, then bermed the excavated soil into protective rims. These berms braced the walls, slowed wind, and added insulation. Into this earthwork foundation rose circles and ovals sized for family groups. Some held 10 or more, arranged in rings that echoed the roundness of hearth and horizon. Their symmetry was not aesthetic alone, it distributed pressure, allowing hides to stretch evenly, creating domes strong enough to shed snow. The framework was an act of heavy labour. Mammoth skulls, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were dragged and levered into place. Tusks curved into arches, their ivory polished smooth by countless hands. Long bones, massive femurs and ribs became rafters and braces. Smaller bones filled the lattice, wedged tight to prevent collapse. Over time, the collection of bones transformed into a skeletal house, a structure that fused permanence with adaptability. Once the skeleton stood, it needed flesh. Hides, stitched with sinew, were layered across the frame. The outermost coverings were heavy tanned mammoth and bison hides resistant to wind and snow. Inside, lighter pelts lined the walls, arranged fur inward, trapping heat in layers of dense fibers. These insulation gradients acted like climate zones. Outer shell to resist storms, inner furs to hold the warmth of bodies and fire. Some coverings were double-stitched, with grasses packed between them for added insulation, creating walls thicker than a man's arm. The smell inside these shelters would have been striking. The musky scent of hides, the faint tang of bone, the ever-present smoke of fire. Yet, compared to the bitter air outside, it was the perfume of life. The hides were not static sheets but dynamic membranes, adjusted seasonally, patched and tightened as needed. Women and children stitched constantly, sinew cords drawn taut, repairs made in rhythm with the cycle of storms. A home was not built once. It was maintained, renewed, tuned to the shifting season. At the centre of every mammoth bone dwelling was fire. A hearth anchored the space, not just as warmth but as social core. Flames licked upward, smoke rising through vents engineered with care. The hearth was more than light, and heat it was the axis around which life revolved. Food was roasted here, tools hardened, stories told. Fire created zones of function. The inner circle for sleeping close to the heat, outer rings for work, crafting and storage. Each circle radiated warmth in gradients, so that tasks demanding dexterity, flint knapping, sewing, carving could be done without frozen fingers. But fire in a closed space is treacherous. Too much smoke and lungs burned, too little oxygen and death crept silently. Paleolithic engineers mastered airflow. They cut low inlets near the ground, allowing cold oxygen to slide inward. High vents, shielded with hide flaps, drew smoke upward in controlled streams. The convection cycle was deliberate, a living lung for the house. On storm nights, flaps were sealed tight, the fire banked low, embers smouldering through darkness. When weather cleared, vents were opened wide, fresh air rushing through like a cleansing tide. Fuel was its own puzzle. In treeless tundra, wood was rare, often driftwood scavenged along rivers. The answer lay in alternative fuels. Dried grasses, gathered in bundles, fed quick flames. Dung, pressed into cakes, burned slow and steady. Even bone itself, when dried and cracked, smouldered with surprising efficiency, releasing stored fat and marrow as energy. Archaeologists have found layers of calcined bone in hearth sites, evidence of this resourceful strategy. Done correctly, these fires gave steady heat with minimal smoke, a lifeline in the long winter night. Imagine stepping into one of these structures as snow sweeps across the plains. Outside, wind shrieks, rattling against the bone frame. Inside, the air is warm, layered with the scent of wood smoke and simmering stew. Shadows flicker across the curved ceiling of tusks and hides. Infants sleep swaddled in furs closest to the hearth, elders wrapped in blankets just beyond. Hunters sit at the edges, repairing spear points by the firelight. Every breath you take feels deliberate, drawn through a system designed to keep the flame alive and the lungs clear. These dwellings were not improvisations, they were machines. Machines of warmth, machines of survival, crafted with precision. Each piece of mammoth bone carried meaning. Each vent was intentional. Each layer of hide was placed with care. To live inside such a space was to live within an engineered environment, one that balanced fragility and resilience, death and survival. And yet, the true power of these shelters was not just physical. They created community. By gathering families under one engineered roof, they concentrated life, laughter, song, and ritual. The fire became a stage for story. The walls became a canvas for shadows. The dome itself became a womb, enclosing fragile humanity against the vast indifference of the Ice Age. These structures were as psychological as they were practical, proof that survival is never only about the body, it is about the mind's need for warmth, order, and hope. From earth to bone to fire, the system was complete. Soil stabilized, bone structured, hides insulated, and fire animated. Together, they formed the winter machine, a dwelling that turned impossibility into routine. But to understand its full brilliance, we must step inside more deeply. We must examine not just the structure itself, but the choreography of life within it, the way space was organized, the way food was stored, the way resilience was designed into daily rhythms. For these were not static shelters. They were living systems, maintained by hands and hearts, tuned by memory, and passed down through generations. The next chapter belongs to the life inside, to the heartbeat of winter machines where survival was not only built, but lived. Inside the mammoth bone domes, life unfolded in patterns as deliberate as the structures themselves. These were not crude shelters filled with chaos, but finely tuned environments where survival required choreography. Every fire, every sleeping space, every storage niche was placed with intention. Step across the threshold, and you entered not just a home, but a winter machine, an engineered ecosystem where warmth, food, and morale intertwined. At the center, the hearth glowed. Flames painted walls of hide with restless light, and smoke curled upward toward vent flaps stitched into the ceiling. This was the nucleus, the sun in a miniature solar system. Closest to the fire lay those most vulnerable, infants swaddled in furs, elders whose bones ached from the cold. Around them, families formed concentric rings, each layer radiating outward like ripples on a pond. Hunters and workers occupied the cooler zones, strong enough to endure the draft that slipped in through low-air inlets. In this order, warmth was distributed as carefully as food. The arrangement extended beyond sleeping. Workstations clustered along the edges, where secondary fires or ember beds provided steady heat without smoke. Here, nimble fingers stitched clothing, carved figurines, or struck sparks from flint. The glow was bright enough for tasks requiring precision, yet gentle enough to conserve fuel. Children learned here, seated beside parents, absorbing not just skills but survival as culture. Every tool produced, every stitch drawn tight, was part of a chain linking one generation to the next. Food was safeguarded with equal care. Against the inner berms, shallow pits served as pantries, cooled by permafrost but insulated from exposure. Frozen carcasses could be stored for weeks, sliced into meals as needed. Narrow side tunnels, dug like miniature corridors, functioned as natural refrigerators during blizzards. There, meat remained chilled yet accessible, even when storms made hunting impossible. The walls of the winter machine were not passive, they actively preserved sustenance, extending the reach of each kill, buffering families against famine. Seasonal cycles dictated maintenance. Construction began in late summer and early autumn, when grasses dried golden under weak sun and hides could be stretched before the freeze set in. By the time snow fell heavy, the structures stood ready, their frames taut and sealed. Through the long winter, the work never ceased. Women patched hides as storms ripped seams, men adjusted vents against shifting winds, children gathered moss to replace bedding fouled by dampness. The machine demanded attention, but in return, it delivered life. Neglect was unthinkable. Every flap and stitch was checked daily, for a single failure in design could unravel the entire system. Yet survival required more than heat and food. It required spirit. Inside these shelters, resilience was not only physical but psychological. Walls became canvases for art lines etched into bone, figurines carved from ivory, ochre pigment smeared across hides. These creations were not idle decorations, they were technologies of morale, ways to remind weary minds that life held beauty beyond endurance. A carved figure tucked into a pouch, a painted symbol glowing in firelight. Such objects were anchors of meaning when the world outside seemed endless and hostile. Gatherings around the hearth bound people together. Stories echoed against bone ceilings, tales of hunts, of ancestors, of spirits that roamed the frozen dark. Music rose too, the hollow call of bone flutes, the rhythmic beat of hands on stretched hide. In these moments, warmth was not only a physical sensation, it was community, a fire stoked in the imagination. When storms howled outside, these rituals transformed fear into narrative, loneliness into belonging. Survival was no longer solitary, it was shared. As winter ebbed, life inside shifted again. Routines gave way to preparations for departure. Domes were not always permanent monuments. Many were dismantled in spring, their bones stacked and cached, hides folded and carried on sleds or backs. Families migrated with their kits, moving toward rivers that teemed with fish, valleys where herds returned to graze. The winter machine was portable knowledge as much as it was physical shelter, ready to be rebuilt wherever the next cold season demanded. Imagine the cycle: autumn's urgency, winter's maintenance, spring's dismantling, summer's planning. It was a rhythm as constant as breath, a choreography repeated for millennia. Within this rhythm, humans did more than survive. They expanded, flourished, and adapted to one of the harshest climates Earth had ever known. Step back for a moment and consider what it meant. Inside the mammoth bone house, every detail worked toward a singular purpose: to make the unlivable livable. Heat radiated in circles. Food remained cold but safe. Minds stayed steady through art and story. These systems were not luxuries, they were necessities, tuned to human vulnerability and resilience alike. The winter machine was not static. It evolved with experience, adapted to new challenges. One family might add deeper storage pits, another might craft more efficient vents. Yet the governing principle endured: survival demanded design. And in that design lay the seeds of something larger. For when many families built many machines, entire regions opened. Shelters clustered along migration corridors, linking communities across the steppe. Knowledge flowed outward, spreading with people, carried in memory and ritual, until the continent itself became mapped not only by rivers and mountains but by the invisible lines of human habitation. Inside the walls of hide and bone, the Ice Age night was held at bay. Fire's glow pushed back darkness, laughter softened fear, and breath itself became part of the machine, feeding the cycle of air that kept lungs alive. It was a choreography of survival so complete, so enduring, that it reshaped human destiny. But this story is larger still. One family's fire tells us much, but what happens when many fires burn, when knowledge spreads, when the mastery of cold becomes the key to expansion? The machine inside the home unlocked the machine of migration, a system not of one hearth but of countless, stretching across the continent, and with it came the spread of culture, memory, and legacy. That is the next chapter, the widening horizon where survival shelters became engines of human expansion. The mastery of warmth did more than keep a few families alive. It unlocked the map of the North. Once humans learned to command earth, bone, and breath, vast territories opened before them, lands that had once seemed inhospitable, where cold alone had kept beasts and landscapes untamed. Shelter was not a side note of survival. It was the foundation of expansion. With dependable winter machines, groups could push farther across the mammoth steppe, tracking herds into regions where no unprotected body could endure. What had been boundaries became corridors. A family with walls of bone and fire at its back was no longer trapped by the season. They could stay, breed, and build. Populations stabilized. From these pockets of stability, culture accelerated. Knowledge moved with the people. Every shelter carried within it the memory of generations. How deep to dig, how to angle a vent, which grasses wicked moisture best. Such details could not be left to chance. One mistake meant freezing, suffocating, starving. So the transmission of craft became ritualized. Elders taught with gravity, apprentices copied with precision, and stories themselves encoded instruction. The night on the Ice Age steppe is a predator in itself. Wind shrieks across frozen plains, scouring the earth with shards of snow. At -40, every breath burns like fire in your chest. Every exhale crystallizes in the air before you. Exposed skin goes numb in moments. Modern bodies, wrapped in down and synthetic fleece, struggle to last a single night here. Yet for tens of thousands of years, Paleolithic families not only endured these nights, they thrived, raised children, dreamed and created. How? Not just how they lived by day, hunting and gathering under a brutal sky, but how they slept, night after night, without freezing into silence. What shield did they conjure between flesh and frost? What secret transformed impossible cold into bearable warmth? The answer is stranger, more ingenious, than the image of huddled figures at a cave mouth. It begins with a hidden rule of survival, one that turns the cold itself into a tool. The picture most people carry of Ice Age survival is simple, almost comforting. Families crouched in the back of caves, wrapped in furs, huddled together until morning. But this picture is incomplete, almost a caricature. Caves were not always the solution. Many were drafty, wet, and dangerous, riddled with predators who also sought shelter. A cave was not a home. It was a gamble, and our ancestors did not rely on chance alone. They engineered survival. This is where the myth dissolves and the method emerges. The governing principle of their existence was not mere endurance, but transformation. When nature tries to kill you, you make nature work for you. It was a rule born of necessity, sharpened across generations, and carried across continents. The cold was never simply an enemy. It was a force to be bent, trapped, redirected. And in that reordering of the environment lay the secret to sleep itself. Think of it as a triad of survival: earth, bone, and breath. Each one was a material and a concept, woven together into a system of protection. The earth provided anchoring heat and insulation, shaping the ground itself into shelter. Bone provided structure and strength, turning the remains of hunted giants into architectural frames. And breath, the movement of air, harnessed through fire and ventilation, ensured that warmth could be sustained without suffocation. Together, these were not improvisations scratched together in panic. They were deliberate systems, repeatable and refined, a kind of thermal engineering long before the word existed. Start with earth. Soil is never as cold as the air above it. Just a few feet down, below the frost line, temperatures stabilize, resisting the brutal swings of the surface. Early humans learned this intuitively. They dug into the ground, carved hollows that became thermal bowls, shelters half buried where the planet itself provided a steady anchor of warmth. This was not a mere hole in the dirt. It was architecture, aligned with prevailing winds, dug to calculated depths, positioned for drainage, and ringed with materials to control temperature and moisture. Then came bone. On the mammoth steppe, wood was scarce. Stunted by the cold, trees were few and precious, but bones were abundant and enormous.